morning, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. I'm John Temin, Director of the Africa Program here. My first job is to ask you to please silence your cell phones. Let me also welcome the audience who's watching online. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very pleased to be able to host what I think is a really important conversation this morning concerning the crisis in South Sudan that I know many of you have been following. Today is May 15th. That means it's been exactly 5 months since the implosion in the world's newest country, and many of us have watched with great alarm the tragic results, reports of 10,000 and perhaps many more killed and more than 1 million displaced. Perhaps a bright spot last Friday when an agreement was signed between President Kiir and Dr. Machar, though we have already seen aspects of it violated, sadly. I think one of the most positive parts of that agreement was some language, and I quote, to ensure the inclusion of all South Sudanese stakeholders in the peace process and the negotiation of a transitional government of national unity in order to ensure broad ownership of the agreed outcomes. And it goes on to say the stakeholders include, among others, political parties, civil society, and faith-based leaders. Today we have a chance to hear from 3 of the leading civil society members who have been working on these issues from various places and whose input we hope will be very critical to the peace process going forward. This includes one of the leading diaspora members who's been deeply engaged on these issues, so we're going to touch on that aspect of the equation as well. We've heard so much over these last few months from the belligerents, the folks with guns. Today we have a chance to hear from those without the guns, whose voices are as or perhaps more important in bringing a more sustainable peace to South Sudan. You should have bios in front of you, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to briefly introduce, we have immediately to my left David Deng, who is the research director with the South Sudan Law Society. And then next to him is Anyeth Dawoul, the founder and director of the Rooch Project for South Sudan. Both David and Anyeth have also been very involved with something called Citizens for Peace and Justice, which they will explain further. And then we also have Isaac Garang, the Director of International Affairs with the Alliance for the South Sudanese in the Diaspora. I should note as well, we were supposed to have 2 additional panelists, including Reverend James Ninru and Edmund Yakani. Very sadly, due to health and other factors, they were not able to travel to the U.S., so we regret they're not here. Hopefully they are watching us online today. So our plan for this morning is I'm going to have a discussion and ask a series of questions to our panelists, and we're going to have a discussion up here concerning many of the pressing issues that a lot of us are talking about on South Sudan. And then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions in this room and also questions from our friends who are watching online. If you're watching online, the way to ask a question is through Twitter using the hashtag South Sudanese Voices. So we welcome those questions as well. So to get started, we'll get to a lot of the issues of the day, but I wanted to start with a question about whether our panelists saw this coming, whether you were at all surprised by what's happened in South Sudan over the past 5 months, and whether South Sudanese and also the international community perhaps could have done a better job in seeing this on the horizon. David, let me start with you on that.
I guess yes and no would be my answer. Certainly people knew things were not going right in the country. An outbreak of violence had been predicted numerous times, from the national elections to the referendum, and I think it got to be a sort of common refrain that everyone was predicting the outbreak of violence. Of course, when it actually happens, it's one thing to predict it and one thing to actually see it. Another way of looking at it is that really the conflict never ended in 2005. And we can look at parts of the country that had been embroiled in really large-scale conflict with huge casualties. And Jonglei State is an excellent example where, if we go back to 2007, there was a forced disarmament campaign. Over a period of a few months, you had, I think, 1,500 people killed and about 3,000 weapons recovered. So 1 person killed for every 2 weapons. That situation persisted for many years. Most recently, my organization, South Sudan Law Society, did a survey in Akobo and Pibor and some other places. We found that 27% of households reported having one or more people killed within the last 2 years. So, I mean, I think in terms of the murder rates and the sort of indicators are those of a conflict, a full-scale conflict in parts of the country. It's just that this was relegated to a very remote rural area and wasn't something that people really had to deal with. And when violence broke out in Juba on December 15th, I was there in all of our faces, and it was, you know, it's not something that anyone could run from. So yes, I mean, I think it was surprising and shocking, but maybe in the way that someone who lives in an earthquake zone is surprised when the actual earthquake happens, but eventually it was going to happen. So.
Yeah. Anyet, were you surprised?
I was surprised that it happened, and I was sad that it happened, but I cannot say that I was extremely shocked that it did happen in the end. The fact that the conflict took the turn that it did, and that the whole country was engulfed in civil war within a matter of hours and days, is a big indication that the conditions were ripe for it. We've had, you know, governance issues, lack of reconciliation, lack of accountability, no service delivery. The security sector